Sidney Crosby was the hero for the Pittsburgh Penguins on Wednesday night as they snapped their losing streak. Pat and I are going to recap that game, plus recap Wilkes-Barre's crazy night against Hershey right after this.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes. You can follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes, joined by my co-host, Patrick Damp. You can follow him on all social media platforms at Synonym for Wet, and you can follow the show's Twitter at LO_Penguins. Of course, thank you all so much for making this your first listen/watch of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Pat, Penguins 3, Utah Hockey Club 2, as the Penguins were able to snap their losing streak and end this road trip on at least a little bit of a high note. They end the road trip overall with a 3-4 record heading back to Pittsburgh on Thursday. And Pat, what type of goal was Sidney Crosby's overtime winner last night?
I believe we call that a vintage Sidney Crosby goal, Hunter. What a beautiful, beautiful goal by him. We'll get to it. I don't want to jump ahead here, but man, that no one else can, well, I don't want to say no one else can do that, but at the very least, no one else can resurrect his team quite like Sidney Crosby.
Sid comes right off the bench, just a beautiful move, cuts to the front of the net. Once he went to the backhand there, you knew it was over. Like, you knew he was scoring there. He's not going to miss from there at all. And he made John Marino look like a pylon there, if I'm being completely honest. And he made the rest of the Utah skaters look also pretty silly there. And goaltender Connor Ingram, just a beautiful move. And I'll also say this. I know this Penguins team is not very good. I'm well aware of that. You're well aware of that. Everyone that watches this team is well aware of that. I will never get tired of watching Sidney Crosby do his thing at age 37. The fact that he is still able to pull off moves like this at 37 is crazy. He is still one of the best players in the league, and he has been fantastic for the last week plus, really putting the team on his back. Yeah, I know they only had a 3-4 road trip, but he was, in my opinion, the best player of this road trip. Caps off that road trip in style, at least with this game, at least, gets the game winner before the Penguins head back to Pittsburgh. Really beautiful stuff there in a game that the Penguins really needed considering how their last 3 games went.
Yeah, listen, this doesn't suddenly make the road trip a success. It still will go down as a complete disaster given the way they performed in California. But at the end of the day, we said it on the show yesterday that they needed this trip to end with some good vibes. It's not a short plane ride back from Utah to Pittsburgh. So at the very least, they're on the plane right now, or they were last night, and they're feeling a little bit better about themselves. Now, I will say this, let's jump into the game here. This had the makings of another disaster. They did not start particularly well. They give up the first goal again. And yeah, they battle back a couple times, but through about 40 minutes, this was not a very good performance by the Penguins. And they deserve full marks for being able to pull themselves up and figure out a way to not only get 1 point, but get the second point in overtime. And they deserve their kudos for that. But this was not some, they got goalied for 60 minutes and they were able to finally break through in overtime kind of game. It wasn't these teams are trading punches back and forth and the team who scores last wins kind of game. This is a game where for about 40 minutes, man, the Penguins, just like the last couple games, looked like they had minimal interest in being there.
I will say, Pat, I'll push back a little bit because the first period, I agree. They were horrendous in that period. They were stuck on 4 shots for what felt like an eternity. That Utah was really taking it to them. They get the early lead. But the Penguins in that second period, to their credit, really pushed back. They were getting a lot of good offensive zone time. They get the tying goal thanks to a good bounce from Marcus Pettersson. Really nice shot, by the way, from Pettersson. But then a couple of minutes later, that's all it really took for the Penguins to kind of brain fart in their own zone. Well, in the offensive zone at first, but then it turned into a brain fart in their own zone because it led to a breakaway. Erik Karlsson, really not sure what he was doing with his awareness there, leads to a breakaway. Ned makes the first save wasn't able to make the second save. And we'll discuss more about Erik Karlsson's performance in just a second, because I felt like he played the worst game of his season in probably the last 4 to 6 weeks, but then he gets to go and does some also really good things in overtime. So a little bit of a mixed bag, even though I still feel like in general, he really wasn't that good in this game. But again, going back to the second period, I felt the Penguins deserved a little bit of a better fate heading into the third. I don't think they deserved to be down after that period. They definitely deserved their fate after the first period, but to their credit, they battle back in the third. They're able to tie the game thanks to Erik Karlsson. Really nice release, by the way he was able to come down the right side of the offensive zone, fire an absolute snipe past Connor Ingram, and then they're able to get that extra point in overtime. That's the first time they've come back from a third period deficit heading into the third period since last season. Pat, it's been that long.
Yeah, it's a huge momentum boost. I don't think this is suddenly going to propel this team to some crazy run where they force their way back into the playoff picture, but at the very least, we talk about this all the time, is there's a lot of guys here who are playing for the trade deadline. Do you want to be a guy that other teams covet and you can go on a Stanley Cup run with them? Do you want to be a guy who's part of the short or long-term solution in Pittsburgh over the next few years and show that you have value here? Then the team should take a chance on you. As for Erik Karlsson, if this isn't the most Erik Karlsson game to ever Erik Karlsson, I don't know what is, because you look at the way he played the majority of the night. It was, like you said, probably his worst performance in 4 to 6 weeks, not making good decisions with the puck, not making good decisions with his positioning, making very puzzling pinches and taking very unnecessary risks at times when he doesn't need to. You know, if they would have been down 2-0, 3-0, 4-0, I will give him all the wiggle room in the world, because your job as Erik Karlsson is to drive offense. You're not a stay-at-home, shut-down defenseman. But when you're in a tight game, you've got to make the correct decisions to keep your team within striking distance. And he made, I can't even explain what he did on Carcone's goal. That was just, it had you shaking your head. But then he makes up for it with an absolute snipe against Connor Ingram. And I loved his quote post game, because this is the kind of confidence only an Erik Karlsson type player can have, saying, I probably could have passed it to Puljujarvi there, but I have 4 goals on the year. I have to start scoring some goals. I don't get down there too often, so I decided to take my opportunity. And, you know, listen, we understand he has been somewhere between disappointing, frustrating, and below what our expectations were for him when he was acquired. But this is the kind of Erik Karlsson confidence you want to see. You want him to say, hell, it was how we explained the power play struggles last year, where we said, forget being nice to Sidney Crosby, forget being nice to Chris Letang, forget being nice to any number of players on this roster. You are Erik Karlsson. Go be Erik Karlsson.
No, I agree. And you saw that snipe. I want him to be more selfish. I feel like he hasn't shot the puck as much as he should this year. He has a really good shot, and I want him to utilize it more. And then you saw in overtime too, the Penguins were out there in their own zone for a pretty long shift. Karlsson, you could tell, was gassed, but I like the way that he was able to kind of pin his defender and the puck along the boards, force Utah to come out of the zone. He was able to get a change. And yes, Utah still had the puck, but it was only for a few more seconds before the Penguins got the puck back, and then they were able to eventually win that game thanks to Sidney Crosby. That was a really underrated play, I felt like, from Erik Karlsson in that game, especially in overtime, because he was able to help eventually get the Penguins the puck back in overtime and help them get that extra point. Also, I should clarify a stat, Pat, that I just had a few minutes ago. This was the 3rd win of this season when trailing after 2 periods. Remember the Kings game and the first Ducks game. So just want to clarify that for my notes. I was a complete moron and brain farted when I said that this was the first time they've come back trailing after 2 periods since last season. They've done it twice this season. So just wanted to have full transparency for all the listeners and watchers out there. But Pat, do you have anything else to add before we head to the second segment here?
Yeah, we appreciate you being transparent, knowing your mistakes. I think the stat you're thinking of, and I just pulled this up, is from Bob Grove from last night, where he said across all his social medias, because I think Bob Grove doesn't actually write things down. It's all in his head, and he just knows everything that happens ever because he's apparently just an encyclopedia. But he said, even though Utah is technically a new franchise, the Penguins have never won a game they trailed after 2 periods against Phoenix, Arizona, Utah. They are 0-12-1 with 1 tie in the previous 14.
That's the one.
So
I apologize.
that was
You're
probably the stat that you had in your head. So it's easy to get those mixed up because, let's be honest, for the most part, this has been another pretty disappointing season for the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Yeah, no, 100%. And you're right. That was the exact stat I was thinking of. So want to apologize to everyone. Pat had that stat, and then I was able to clarify the other stat that I had in my notes for today's show. But that will do it for the first segment. Coming up in the second segment, we're going to discuss Alex Nedeljkovic's really strong game, plus a couple of other players who I felt were really good in this game as well. But before we get to that, we got to tell you all about our first sponsor, and that is Game Time. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. And while I have never attended an NFL playoff game, I still have attended other playoff games, including the Washington Nationals against the St. Louis Cardinals in 2012. Jason Worth hit a walk-off home run in Game 4. That's the loudest I've ever heard Nationals Park, and I've been there quite a few times. Going to playoff games is so much fun. I hope I can go to a Steelers playoff game at some point. And speaking of that, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't even have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, we're back here in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes, joined by my co-host, Patrick Tam. So, Pat, when we were previewing this game for the Wednesday edition of the show, I was kind of like, okay, I want to see what Yoel Blomqvist can do for this game because Ned's been getting a lot of starts. He was fine against San Jose. He was not the reason they lost, but I still wanted them to potentially see what Blomqvist could do to at least close out this road trip just because, you send Jari down to Wilkes-Barre, you bring Blomqvist up, but he hasn't really played too many of these games. I understand that Mike Sullivan has a plan, but I kind of want to see Blomqvist get more starts considering the level that he's played at this year. So when they announced Ned, I was kind of like, oh, like really? You're not going to give the kid a shot here? But hey, I will admit I was wrong about that one because Ned played really well last night. Made a lot of great timely saves, especially in the third period, Pat, when Utah was trying to either A, extend the lead when they were up 2-1, or B, try to take the lead when the Penguins were tied after Erik Karlsson had his big goal. And he came up with timely save after timely save. And that's the type of goaltending, again, that this team really has needed throughout this season. They really haven't gotten a lot of these timely saves, especially in the third period where it's a tight game. And I feel like that's really cost the Penguins some valuable points in the standings. But to his credit, Ned was able to give them those saves last night. Really good stuff from him. I just get a little bit worried because I don't want them to overwork him. I feel like when he gets overworked, and you saw that down the stretch last season, even though the Penguins were winning more games, his game kind of starts to deteriorate a little bit. So I just don't want them to play him too often. And then Blomqvist is just kind of sitting on the bench like, hey, I'm also here. But I'm sure they'll have a plan for these final 4 games before the Four Nations face-off. But I will say, credit to Ned, really strong performance last night.
Yeah, a couple things that I want to go over with Ned. First, let's talk about the performance. I mean, Utah only gets, I believe it was 9 shots in the third period, but you pull up natural stat trick and they got 5 high danger chances in the third period. So Alex Nedeljkovic didn't get a lot of work in the third period, but he got enough work where he had to make a bunch of big saves to keep the Penguins in it. And he passed that test with flying colors. So you have to be very, very encouraged about that. And as for the workload for both of these goalies, I kind of have an operating theory as we get closer to the Four Nations face-off. One, I'm starting to get the sense that they think there's going to be a market for Alex Nedeljkovic at the trade deadline. So they're probably giving him the lion's share of the starts and hoping these performances continue because of the last week, he has been very solid. Is he a bona fide number 1 goalie? No, but if you're a team that maybe needs a little bit of juice in goal, or you need an insurance policy in case you have an injury in goal, there's an affordable deal waiting to be had in Alex Nedeljkovic in Pittsburgh. So I had starting to kind of have that thought as well. I also think they're probably doing this in the sense that they're probably going to put Blomqvist back in Wilkes-Barre once the Four Nations face-off happens, so he can actually play more rather than just take a vacation. So I wouldn't be shocked to see him sent back down come the Four Nations face-off, but obviously we'll see what happens with that. But at the end of the day, I loved his performance last night. You can't blame him for any of Utah's 2 goals. And he made the saves he needed to make when he was called upon. So liked his performance, and it wouldn't shock me, like I said, if they're showcasing him a little bit ahead of the first deadline before the Four Nations face-off. And then if nothing happens, then after when we get to the actual trade deadline.
And then in that case, if they were to trade Nedeljkovic, I'm guessing your tandem would just be Jari and Blomqvist. And I mean, I would still give Blomqvist a lion's share of the starts, considering what we've seen from Jari, especially for the final month of the season, where, again, we don't think they're going to make the playoffs. If that's the route that they choose, Pat, which I think for me, it's a little more unlikely, in my opinion, just because I think of the two, you would rather trade Jari, but I understand that Ned is probably easier to deal. But if you were to have that as a tandem, I would want to see the young kid play in games down the stretch, even though I don't think they're going to make the playoffs. That's still someone that I want to see get meaningful reps heading into next season, where I feel like he could potentially get like a full split of the reps, maybe even a bit more, etc. And if they do send Blomqvist down during the Four Nations face-off break, that does create a little bit of a logjam unless you're sending Murashov back to Willing. And we'll get to Murashov in a second because of how great he played last night against Hershey. Pat, he's now lighting up the AHL. Like, his AHL numbers are ridiculous. Hasn't lost a game. His save percentage is ridiculous in only 4 starts. So that would create another logjam, but I at least get what you're saying, that he could potentially get more reps down there during that time. It's a lot of this I feel like is pretty fluid in my opinion. So, but overall, really like Ned's game. We'll have to see if he gets another start this weekend against the Predators. The Penguins will play 4 more games for the Four Nations face-off. And I also want to shout out Marcus Pettersson for this game. I felt like against the Sharks, had that really bad turnover that led to a goal against. He responded really well in this game, was really good in his own zone, gets a little bit of offense going, especially with that shot to first tie the game for the Penguins before Utah took the lead a bit later in that game. But I felt like he played a really strong game in all 3 zones. Really liked his game. Also thought Jesse Puljujärvi played totally fine in his return to the lineup. And then, Pat, I know you wanted to discuss this before we head to our final segment. Boko Imama gets that fight under his belt. What did you see from that fight that you really liked?
I mean, the thing for me is I don't love staged fighting. I have been pretty vocal that I think it's stupid. The one asterisk I will put on it is when you play a team that you had a violent physical game against within a 2-week span, and you have that opening draw face off where you just go, all right, listen, this is the end of it. We're going to have this fight off the opening face off, and then we're going to play hockey. That, even though I think that's stupid, at the very least, that staged fight I can understand. This one, while again, not a huge fan of staged fighting, I think this was more of just a statement from Boko Imama to say, I don't want to go back to Wilkes-Barre yet. Has he been really good for the Penguins? He's been fine. He's bringing a good forecheck. He's throwing some solid hits, and he's not hurting you when he's on the ice. But to me, I look at that as a message from a player who's in his late-ish 20s, who hasn't really carved out much of an NHL career, saying to management, like, listen, I know the team that I'm on right now. I know where this team is. Keep me here for a little bit and I'll be a spark plug. I'll throw some big hits. I'll occasionally get in a fight, and if nothing else, you can say this much about it. It brings some entertainment to a team that might not be that entertaining, because are you going to buy a ticket to watch him? No, not on a team with Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and all the other players, but you certainly won't forget about that. You'll certainly think, maybe if this kid's in the lineup tonight, we'll see a fight. And Again, I don't think a staged fight, because that's pretty much what it was, because they were just at center ice throwing them. It wasn't much of a fight, but it's those little things from players like that that send messages to management, the coaching staff, that say, hey, I'm not quite ready to go back to the American League. Give me a little bit longer of a look.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more to that fight, you can tell the players on the bench really appreciated it. You could tell they got a bit fired up after it, even though the Penguins, again, started out the game pretty poorly. You could still tell that they were pretty fired up to continue playing that game after Boko Mama got into that fight. We'll have to see if he keeps staying in the lineup for these last 4 games before the Four Nations faceoff break. I will say I did not like that Philip Tomasino came out of the lineup. They didn't really say too much about it, Pat. I don't think he's hurt. Don't think he's sick. It looks like he was just a healthy scratch, which I'm not okay with that. I think he's one of your top 12 forwards when this team is fully healthy. Even with, especially with Evgeny Malkin hurt right now and week to week, I think he's probably going to be back after the break with the Four Nations face-off. But why are you scratching him? Just in general, I don't get that at all from Mike Sullivan. I think that's a really dumb thing to do. But hey, again, that's just my opinion. But that will do it for this second segment. Coming up in the final segment, it was also a great night for the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Penguins, because they absolutely whooped Hershey on Wednesday and had big-time performances from Ville Koivunen, Vasily Ponomarev, and Sergei Murashov. Pat and I are going to recap that game and discuss whether we could get some call-ups from that team, especially Koivunen and Ponomarev, right after this. All right, we're back here in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes, joined by my co-host, Patrick Dam. So, Pat, what a night for, honestly, the entire Pittsburgh Penguins organization, including Wilkes-Barre. They whooped Hershey last night, and shout out to Ville Koivunen and Vasily Ponomarev. Ponomarev gets a hat trick. He was sensational. But how about Ville Koivunen, man? 4-goal performance. The last one, he made the Hershey goalie look like an absolute fool in net. That move was sensational. He leads all AHL rookies in points this season. He has 14 goals, 35 points in 37 games, right around a point per game. Vasily Ponomarev, 10 goals, 24 points in 28 games. We were kind of hinting at this conversation a little bit during our episode on Wednesday, and that these guys, both of them, I think should get call-ups after the trade deadline. I think to this point, they have showed that they deserve a little bit of an extended look at the NHL, and they're really heating up down in Wilkes-Barre. And one more thing before I pass this over to you. I want to take an opportunity to kind of dunk on myself for the Jake Guentzel trade a little bit. We both came on here to give our raw analysis, raw reactions right after that trade was made. And I'll fully admit to everyone, I gave that trade a bit of a low grade. I wasn't that happy with it just because I was so focused on getting one of a Scott Morrow or Jackson Blake or a guaranteed first-round pick that I kind of let those things blind myself to the overall return. I also personally did not think Michael Bunting was going to help that much. And I just want to say that so far, I have looked like a complete idiot when it comes to that deal. I have no problem dunking on myself. I actually encourage to be wrong about things. I try to give the best analysis that I can for everyone on this show, while also knowing that I am going to be wrong about things. And so far, with that trade, I have been wrong. Michael Bunting has been a great fit. Ponomarev has been awesome down in Wilkes-Barre, and I think he's going to be a solid bottom 6 player in the NHL. And Ville Koivunen in his first North American season has been fantastic, and I really want to see what he can do at the NHL level once he comes up, hopefully after the deadline. And also that second-round pick that they got, Pat, turned into Harrison Brunick, who might really make this team next year. So just wanted to say that I have been a complete moron for my original take about that trade. And hey, I'm going to use that as a learning lesson to maybe not jump the gun so much on some trade reactions and stuff like that.
I'm not going to dunk on you for it, because if you remember, I was fine with the deal. I wasn't jumping for joy. I wasn't exactly upset about it either, but I'm going to bring something up that I know in the city of Pittsburgh is going to be absolutely verboten because people will hate it. If there is one thing Kyle Dubas does that is extremely smart, you know who is someone he learned from in a different sport? He learned from the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick. If you remember, obviously, I know a bunch of people are going to be throwing things at their TV or yelling at their iPhones as I say this. yes, I understand they had the greatest quarterback of all time. And when you have that, it's pretty easy to win. But one of the reasons they sustained their success for so long was Belichick did something that Kyle Dubas is doing here in Pittsburgh. He's going almost quantity over quality when it comes to prospects and draft picks. If you remember, Belichick would frequently trade down in the draft. He would give up a second-round pick to get 2 third-round picks. He'd give up a third-round pick to get 2 fourth-round picks. And it's a lot easier for you to develop new talent and hit on picks when you have more of them. It's very easy and tempting to think, oh, I've got a second-round pick. I'll get a great player with that second-round pick. Well, if that's the only one you have and it doesn't pan out, you're left holding the bag. But if you pick 2 players in the 3rd round, where, yeah, it's going to take development, it's definitely still a lottery ticket, there's more of a chance for those prospects to hit if you've got 2 or 3 of them rather than 1 of them. And that's something we have seen from Dubas over the past 14-ish months is he's getting a bunch of prospects. He's getting a bunch of picks. And now you're going to have both a larger pool of players to look at and likely a deeper pool because these guys are going to develop and all be battling one another to eventually become NHL players. So you look back to where we started with this in the Jake Gensel deal. Yeah, he didn't get any of the big prospect names out of Carolina, but he got multiple and they're all starting to develop. And then that second round pick, like you said, turns into Harrison Brunick. So this is how you retool a team like this on the fly. It's real easy to say, oh, let's trade our top guy for a top prospect and a first round pick. We have seen, especially when you pick outside of the top 10, it's not a guaranteed thing that those guys in the first round are going to become something. Yeah, it's real enticing to have that high second round pick, but there's multiple players who never develop into anything significant in that round. But if you get multiple of them, you have more of an opportunity to develop them and bring them into the system. So at the end of the day, the Michael Bunting, Jake Gensel trade with Carolina was kind of the first bullet fired in this retool rebuild. And it gave us an idea of where it's going. And because of how well Wilkes-Barre played last night with those guys being the catalyst, it's looking like a very good deal.
100%. And that was really the start, I feel like, of really restocking this pipeline with legit prospects. If they get a top 5 pick this year, get some lottery luck and all that stuff, I think that could be the first true big difference maker to be in that pipeline in quite a while. And especially, Pat, if they wound up deciding to tank again or accidentally tank, again, next year and potentially try to go get Gavin McKenna, yeah, that's an even bigger difference maker for your team for not just, the season after that, but well into the future as well. So again, they have some good dudes in the system right now. But again, if they are able to get that top 5 pick this year and get a true difference maker, that's only going to really improve this pipeline even more. But I really like the moves that he's doing to try and restock the system. Again, Ponomarev, he's playing great. Koivunen, he's playing great. Hell, Pieniemi was great during the World Juniors, Pat. He was fantastic for Team Finland. Heck, also, we should shout out Sergei Murashov, my friend. He has played great in Wilkes-Barre since coming up. 4-0 this season, only 6 goals allowed, 1 shutout, .950 save percentage. He's already too good for the ECHL. He's now lighting up the AHL. So they're going to have to figure out something when it comes to this goalie rotation, my friend.
Yeah, they really are. And he played well last night. And the thing that a lot of people, I think, got to understand about this victory for Wilkes-Barre last night is this was not a bottom feeder that they beat 9-0. This is the Hershey Bears. They are one of the best teams in the American Hockey League. They lead the same division that the Baby Penguins are in. As of last night, they were not, before the game, they were 9 points up on the Baby Penguins for first in that division. And the Baby Penguins came out and absolutely blitzed them. Here's the thing that you may have mentioned it. I got so excited over the trade and prospect talk that it might have left my brain. But This wasn't they came on late. They were up 8-0 after the first 2 periods. So they only added a goal in the third. So they absolutely cruised against one of the best teams in the American League. And to bring it all full circle, yeah, there's a handful of career AHLers and guys who aren't going to be NHL, even contributors, let alone superstars, anytime soon for the Penguins. But this kind of brings it all together where there are a lot of players on this Wilkes-Barre team who look like they have bright futures, and they went out and played a very, very good Hershey team and made it look almost academic against a great hockey team.
Agreed, man. And again, it's going to be really fascinating to see after the deadline. Do they bring up all three of Koivunen, Ponomarev, and McGroarty? Do they bring up two of them, one of them? Heck, if you're me, I'd probably just bring up all three, considering the level that they've been playing at this year, especially lately. And if you're able to move out, extra forward or two, and all that stuff, I would 100% do it just to see what they can do for the final month and if they can really carry that momentum into the offseason and then into the 25-26 season. But I think that'll do it for today's episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to / watch this one. Pat and I will be back with another show for you all on Friday to get you all set for this bobblehead night, Patrick Hornquist bobblehead night against the Nashville Predators on Saturday. And we'll also do a look ahead to the other 3 games before the Four Nations face-off as well. So for Patrick Damp, I'm Hunter Hodes. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We both appreciate it. We'll be back on Friday.